Hello everyone. In some of my previous presentations, I have discussed research questions, research hypotheses, and research objectives separately. The current presentation is aimed at exploring these three concepts in an integrated way. So what are these concepts and how are these interrelated? So here we can see that these three research concepts, that is research questions, research hypotheses, and research objectives, are actually a response to our choice of the research topic. My contention is that the research process actually begins with research questions, and this leads to, in most cases, to research hypotheses, and then research objectives are actually the aims of the research in terms of responding to research questions and research hypotheses. So first, let's begin with a brief introduction to research questions. Now, first of all, what are research questions? A research question is a broader question around which the research process or the research project revolves. So we can say that the primary aim of the research project is to explore possible answers to the research questions. So we can also say that research questions play the role of a pivot in the research process, and so the whole research process actually revolves around finding answers to the research question or research questions. A simple example of a research questions could be this: what are the causes and consequences of bullying in schools? Now, why do we need research questions? We need research questions because research questions are something that actually help us in beginning the process of research. And so generally the process of research revolves around our questions such as the what, why, how, when, or where of the natural or social phenomena. So as I said earlier, research questions give focus or direction to the research process. And the achievement of research objectives actually depends on finding answers to our research questions. Now, the how of research questions. So there are different types of research questions. And these research questions will depend on the kind of research type that we conduct. So, for example, descriptive research questions in exploratory studies will have questions that focus on exploring and describing social phenomena. For example of that could be, what are school teachers' perceptions about effective strategies for classroom management? Similarly, if we have correlational studies, we will have questions that focus on identifying a relationship between variables. For example, what is the relationship between teachers' teaching methodology and students' attention in the classroom? So, such a question will be in response to correlational studies. Then the how could also be the how of research questions will also depend on the nature of research studies, such as, for example, causal and experimental studies. We may have research questions that aim at determining the causes of effects. So, the questions that are asked in such studies will determine cause-effect relationships. So, for example, what is the effect of direct method of teaching on students' learning? So, in conclusion, what we can say is that the type and number of research questions will depend on the nature and type of research topics and objectives. We move on to the to further elaborate on the how questions related to research questions is that how to develop good research questions. So in order to develop good research questions, we need to reflect on personal experiences or observations. Similarly, reading, and actually a lot of reading, in-depth reading will help us in finding research questions. Similarly, reflections on our reading, that actually means critical reading, discussion with colleagues, teachers, supervisors, drafting initial questions, reflecting and refining, focusing and pruning of those questions, and similarly getting peer review or feedback, and lastly finalizing. So this is the general process of developing research questions. Now moving on to the second part, that is research hypothesis. What is a research hypothesis? A research hypothesis is actually a tentative explanation, prediction, or proposition formulated for testing or exploring empirically. So research hypotheses are generally based on assumed relationships between variables in a research study. So assumed relationships are relationships that we actually assume between variables. So we have still not empirically found that relationship or explored that relationship. So what we can also say is that hypotheses state the assumed relationship between independent and dependent variables before the actual existence or otherwise of this relationship is empirically established. Examples of hypotheses could be these: socioeconomic status of students affect their self-esteem. Now this is an assumed relationship between socioeconomic status of students and their self-esteem. Similarly, there is significant relationship between teachers' teaching style and students' classroom participation. So again, this is an assumption, and this remains an assumption till we actually go through the process of the empirically either accepting this hypothesis or rejecting it in the light of the data that we get. Further, hypothesis is something that could be accepted or rejected once empirical studies are conducted. But acceptance or rejection of hypothesis actually does not mean that our research has no value. For example, if we reject the hypothesis. Generally, good hypothesis is something that should indicate relationship between variables clearly. Good hypotheses should be presented in precise language. Good hypotheses should be representative of the research objectives, and these should be testable empirically. So if these are the characteristics of good hypotheses, and hypotheses that lack these characteristics will not be considered very useful. Why do we need hypotheses? As in the case of research questions, hypotheses is something that help us in giving direction and focus to the research process. Generally, hypotheses require the researcher to do sufficient reading and reflection around the topic before formulating and refining hypotheses. So here we need to have better understanding of the background and the previous literature in comparison to research questions that actually are more useful in terms of more exploratory studies where we have less background knowledge of the topic. And also, hypotheses give tentative answers to our questions. So we begin with questions, but hypotheses could be like tentative answers to our research questions. And lastly, these help in giving direction to the research, to the process of data collection, analysis, and interpretation. The how of hypothesis, or how we actually, what is the process of formulating hypotheses? So generally we begin with research questions in most exploratory studies, and so those initial research questions will begin us on the process of reading or literature review, and then that will lead to our formulation of hypotheses or hypotheses, refinement of hypotheses, which is again a process of reflection, discussion, and peer review. And this needs to be accepted or rejected as a consequence of then the actual research process. So that's the general process of where hypotheses begin and how do we actually work with hypotheses in research. Now, there are different types of research hypotheses. So, and again, it depends on the kind of research that we are conducting. Descriptive hypotheses are hypotheses that state existing state or form or nature of something. For example, corporal punishment is prevalent in school. Now, this shows state or the existing state of a particular phenomena, that is corporal punishment. Similarly, on the other hand, relational hypotheses are hypotheses that state relationship or causation. So there could be two ways in which relational hypotheses work. Relational hypotheses or causational hypotheses, or exploring relationships or causation. For example, relational hypotheses that are generally used in correlational studies is, an example of that is female students' academic achievement is better in social sciences than male students. Now, this is a relationship of academic achievement with gender. This hypothesis shows that. Similarly, example of causation. For example, parental involvement enhances students' academic achievement. So here we see that we are trying to explore that the cause of better academic achievement of students is parental involvement. Now, the how or the types of it also includes categorizations such as simple hypothesis and complex hypothesis. So a simple hypothesis is based on relationship, that is cause-effect relationship of two variables, an independent variable and a dependent variable. Example of this is corporal punishment affects the mental health of students. Complex hypothesis, on the other hand, explores relationships, that is cause-effect relationship among multiple variables that are the independent and dependent variables. So, for example, a simple example of the complex hypothesis here is corporal punishment affects the mental health of students, which results in the poor academic performance of students. So here you can see that there are more than two variables, and so this type of hypothesis is called complex hypothesis. Hypotheses have also been categorized into null hypothesis, which is actually a type of hypothesis that assumes that there is no significant relationship between variables, that is dependent and independent variable, or that change in one variable is not the effect of another variable, denoted by HO. Example, corporal punishment does not affect the mental health of students. So this is an example of null hypothesis. Or there is no significant relationship between corporal punishment and students' mental health. And then alternative hypothesis. This type of hypothesis assumes that there is significant relationship between variables, that is dependent variable and independent variable, or that one variable is the consequence of another variable. So this is denoted by H1. Examples. So there are two types of the alternative hypothesis. One is the non-directional hypothesis, where we do not know about the direction in which a particular variable affects another variable. So there is significant relationship between corporal punishment and mental health of students. Here we do not know the direction of this relationship of corporal punishment and mental health. Corporal punishment affects students' mental health. Again, we do not see the direction here. That is, in what ways, or like is it affects it positively or negatively. So we don't know about this. Directional hypothesis, on the other hand, is something that also shows the direction of the relationship or the impact. So there is significantly positive relationship between corporal punishment and mental health of students. Here you see that it assumes not just relationship but also the fact that it is positive relationship. Similarly, corporal punishment negatively affects students' mental health. So this is also one of the categorization where we have alternative hypothesis further divided into non-directional and directional hypothesis. Now the last part of this presentation, the research objectives. So what are research objectives? So as I said in the beginning, generally we begin social science research with research questions or research hypotheses. And research objectives are actually formulated in order to explore possible answers to the central research questions, or to respond to our research hypothesis, that is to accept or reject research hypotheses. So what we can say is that research objectives are achieved when the research process results in finding possible answers to research questions, or in the acceptance or rejection of our research hypotheses. So why do we need research objectives? So as was the case with research questions and research hypotheses, research objectives are needed because these help us give clear direction to the research process. These help us in focusing our study, bring in objectivity to the research process, so we are not moving here and there in all directions. We remain objective and we get focus in terms of exploring our research questions and hypotheses. These help in specifying research design as well. That is the kind of sample that we should have, data collection and analysis. And these help in organizing our discussion, analysis, interpretation, and conclusion of the research study. Now, how do we formulate our research objectives? We formulate our research objectives keeping in view these points. First, our research objectives should be representative of our research topic and research questions. Secondly, our research objectives should be in the light of the research gap that we have identified, because the objective basically is to fill that research gap. Then critical analysis of existing knowledge and knowledge gap, that is also important in order to prepare good research questions. Besides, we need to get peer review on our research questions, such as review by our supervisors or other researchers, senior researchers generally. Time and resource availability is also something that will help us in terms of refining our research questions. Clarity and focus in terms of language and presentation, that is also important for developing good research questions, and also that research questions should be achievable. Now here the last thing is that here is an example of how to develop good research questions and to focus research questions. So here I have given, the first one is a very broad research question that I think is not a very good question because it is too broad and lacks focus. For example, to compare teacher education programs in Pakistan and the UK. So if this is one of the main objectives of your research, this is something that is too broad. For example, what are you going to compare in these two very different teacher education systems? So we can focus it a bit and present it in a bit better way, for example, to compare initial teacher education programs in Pakistan and the UK. Again, it is quite broad and it lacks focus, but it is a bit less broader and has a bit more focus because it is now focusing on initial teacher education. But again, because initial teacher education has so many aspects, so again, this is a bit broader. So the third way in which I have formulated that research objective, the green font, to compare initial teacher education programs in Pakistan and the UK in terms of theory-practice balance. So this is an objective that is more focused because here we have these two teacher education programs and we are comparing these two for a central variable or a central focal point, and that is the theory-practice balance. So where do we have better theory-practice balance in the initial teacher education program? For example, is it in the UK program, or is it such as the PGCE there, or is it in the B.Ed program, initial B.Ed program in Pakistan? So which program has better theory-practice balance? Now this is a more focused research objective. We can further focus even this objective or subdivide it into finer objectives or focus it on a particular program or course inside the initial teacher education program. So this was a general overview of the three main and very important concepts of research questions, research hypotheses, and research objectives. And as we can see that these three concepts are pretty much interdependent and they are very integrated, and the clarity of each of these will actually lead to clarity in terms of the process of research and the outcomes of research.